The other aspect of Murdoch is the way the journalism begins to run up against the truth. Because when you're a deeply ideological person, you see the world in those terms, and things that don't fit your ideology are simply dismissed. There's two really brilliant examples of this that I go into in the book. One is in the 1990s, when a number of Murdoch papers started a campaign to deny there was any connection between HIV and AIDS. In Britain, the Sunday Times began a campaign against what it called the medical establishment, which had proposed that HIV virus causes AIDS. Based on strong medical research, this perfectly accurate deduction was treated as a politically correct orthodoxy. One or two contrarian medical researchers were held up as heroic dissidents against this left-wing orthodoxy. And on this basis, the Sunday Times undermined all public health warnings about the then fatal condition. And when reputable scientists strongly criticised the Sunday Times for AIDS denialism, the newspaper loudly accused them of censorship. The newspaper said it simply wanted to encourage debate. If that sounds familiar, it should do, because almost exactly the same approach is found in the newspaper The Australian when it deals with climate change. According to this newspaper, the climate deniers, regardless of their lack of evidence and in most cases scientific qualifications, are actually brave dissidents, rebels, against an orthodox set of beliefs. And Murdoch's media has provided a platform for climate deniers over the last 15 years. And in Australia, his newspapers are in fact the main outlet for climate denial. On issues like AIDS or climate, I think most people would agree that in the end it all comes down to evidence. But that's another reason for being worried about a newspaper like The Australian. Its standard of evidence was illustrated recently in an editorial which was talking about the scientific predictions of sea level rises. It said it made, quote, no apologies for reporting that surfers who have frequented the same beaches for 50 years have found no increase in sea levels. This is the editorial. This is the editorial of the flagship newspaper of the Murdoch Group. Surfers don't see any rises. Water levels so high. Come on. It's an open and shut case, really. Seriously, this would be embarrassing in any newspaper, let alone one that freely dispenses advice to scientists and policymakers. But the newspaper does have some admirers. Shortly after this extraordinary editorial, The Australian's editor-in-chief, Chris Mitchell, won a prize from the oil and gas exploration industry for his newspaper's coverage of climate change. And they proudly put it in a little box on page 2. Extraordinary. Speaking of evidence, of course, this is a newspaper that accepted the so-called evidence for the existence of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. That evidence was enough to start a war which cost $1 trillion and which killed up to 100,000 people. The evidence of climate change built up by scientists over 3 decades, no. That can be just brushed aside. In my view, publishing articles and editorials which deny climate science is the moral equivalent of publishing quack cures for cancer. In Australia, Murdoch's media power is probably greater than anywhere else in the world because of the concentrated ownership of Australian newspapers. And it's often forgotten that in a federation like Australia, it's at the state level that governments and political parties are powerful, and that's where his real power is. It's in the Daily Telegraph, it's in the Herald Sun, it's in the Courier Mail. Of course, in Darwin, Brisbane, Adelaide and Hobart, Murdoch has a monopoly in newspapers. And newspapers are important because they set the agenda for radio and television. So sure, they're dead trees, it's legacy media, all that stuff. Newspapers are still the biggest sources of news, and they're the big agenda setters for the media as a whole. So after all this, is Murdoch really powerful? Well, a good indication of any media owner's power is the behaviour of politicians towards them. When a party is in opposition, it's at its most vulnerable, it's the most dependent on positive coverage in the news media. And it's a bit of a tradition in Australia that federal opposition leaders, both Labor and Liberal, make a point of seeing Murdoch personally. And by the way, this means they go to him. He doesn't come to them. And that's, of course, what Tony Blair did in 1995, I think it was, when he came out all the way out to Australia to speak at one of Murdoch's conferences. John Howard made the pilgrimage to Murdoch's office in the late 1980s, and Bruce Guthrie, who was an editor of the Herald Sun, saw Howard when Howard was opposition leader in the 1980s, waiting to see Murdoch, and he said his hands were trembling so much he spilled his glass of water. Is Murdoch powerful? Good example. Kevin Rudd, of course, went to New York, saw Murdoch, ended up in a lap dancing club, presumably trying to demonstrate that he was really one of the boys. Today, another opposition leader, Tony Abbott, has met Murdoch. I don't know whether his hands trembled or whether they went to a nightclub together. But one thing's clear, Murdoch has told his editors that he likes Tony Abbott. And that's no secret, because you simply have to look at all the newspapers in Sydney and it becomes very, very obvious. Thank you very much.